composting and water conservation. When we think about that, it's not necessarily as exciting as some of the topics that we discuss other times, planting and vegetable gardening, but what we're talking about today can make all of those good things happen in your garden, and that's what makes them important. If you haven't met me, my name's Angela Judd. I was a Master Gardener in 2015. The composting class during my Master Gardener classes was really exciting for me because I was in a room full of people who wanted to learn about composting. So we are going to cover composting, typical composting, in-bed vermicomposting, and water conservation. What is compost? So it's a mixture of ingredients that we use to fertilize and improve the soil. When we think about what we're giving our plants when we give them compost, it's like giving them healthy food as opposed to junk food. When we're feeding our soil all the good things that they need, it needs to grow well, as opposed to maybe a quick fix of some Miracle Grow or something to help it over time improve and grow, just like healthy food would with your body. So decomposing plants, food waste, organic materials, all of those things are what go into making compost. So it's rich in lots of nutrients and beneficial organisms. So composting is really when we take an active role in helping those things break down. If you go to the forest, there's composting going on, right? The leaves fall from the trees and they're breaking down. And eventually, if we just left everything alone, it would happen in our gardens too, in our yards. If we just put everything into a pile and let it break down, that's what would happen. It would eventually break down. But when we're trying to actively compost, we want to speed up that process. We want to help it along, and so we can have a more active role in that. So what can we compost? Really, anything that came from the earth in some plant form is compostable. What we do with compost when we want to kind of improve that or make it speed up a little bit, it's making the pieces smaller, and then we're also adding air and water to that process. So just basically that's what we're doing, is trying to speed up that process a little bit so we can have that compost to add. So why does compost help? It improves our soil, adds nutrients, introduces beneficial microbes, and healthier plants. So it's not just because it has a specific, NPK ratio, or you're giving it just one thing. You're giving your soil a whole broad range of what it needs, and then that soil is going to use what it needs and build up and get better and better over time. So that's why maybe the first year that you're gardening, your garden doesn't do as well, but over time, as you use good principles and practices with composting and adding compost and organic matter to your soil, it's going to get better over time. There's a million different ways we can compost, right? There's all different kinds of methods. If you Google composting, there's a lot of different methods. But today I'm going to talk about two specific types of how to compost that are really practical for the home gardener. These are things that are simple to do, and we'll give you a good overview of those processes. So the first one is in-bed worm composting. Who's heard of this? Okay, lots of people. So this is vermicomposting. This is using worms to break down food scraps. And then more traditional composting, which what you would think of as the big piles of leaves and things like that. So when you're trying to decide, okay, which one should I do, right? It's because it depends on really what you have. So in-bed vermicomposting is best if you are trying to just use up your day-to-day food scraps. If you have small amounts of food waste coming from the kitchen, by far the easiest way to take care of that food waste. It's a simple method, it's really easy to get started, and it's not difficult at all. So if you have a garden, this is a really easy way to compost. Traditional composting is best if you have a large yard or you have a yard and you have access to a lot of plant material. If you have yard waste like leaves and a lot of plant matter, that is a good option, because obviously you're not going to put those in your vermicomposting bins. So if you have a large amount of food waste and plant material, yard waste, all of those things, it's on a bigger scale. And it can be a little bit more complicated. Like, it's a little bit harder to get that process down. It takes a little bit more work. You're more actively involved in it. You definitely can do it. So if you have those inputs, you want to try and do that method for sure too. And you don't have to choose, you can do both. So first we're going to talk about in-bed vermicomposting. An overview of that is that you're using a bin buried in the garden bed, and you add shredded cardboard for worms, food scraps, and browns on top, and then you're adding worms. The worms are eating the food scraps, and then they're creating worm castings. So that's vermicomposting in a nutshell. The reason we use the bins, it's not for the worms. If we just add food scraps to our garden beds, if we just bury them, the worms will still find those food scraps, and it works just fine. The reason that we're using the bin is because we want that end product. We want to have access to some of those worm castings to harvest and use in the rest of our garden. So that's just something to think about. The first, if you just want to compost some food scraps directly into your garden beds, that would work too. So there's a couple of different ways you can do it. Why do we want worm castings? And if we look at that very first reason, I think that's reason enough, right? Who has had struggles with pests in your garden? Right? They've been problematic. So this is one of the benefits of worm castings, is having soil rich in that microbial activity that worm castings provide helps those plants repel pests. Also helps the plants grow and absorb nutrients under challenging conditions. Have we had any challenging conditions in our garden? When don't we, right? I feel like it's been a tough year. So it helps your plants. Again, it offers them all of these good nutrients, and then they can take what they need in order to fight off whatever it is that they're fighting off. It gives them a good opportunity. And I would say compost is probably like that good food that we eat. Worm castings is like a really like a multivitamin, even more so. You know, it's more concentrated, those good nutrients and microbial activity. It's also providing healthy bacterial that will enrich the soil. And you're providing an opportunity for that soil to absorb more water, which is crucial, right? We want our soil to be able to retain water, to keep our plants hydrated so that they can withstand those tough conditions that we're asking them to withstand. So adding worm castings helps with that. It helps that soil just be ready. Worm castings and compost, those two things can help your soil more than anything else. You know, people will say, you know, what kind of fertilizer should I, what should I use? And there are times when we want to use fertilizer, but as a general rule, if you're adding compost and in-bed vermicomposting bins and you have worm castings, that is going to help your garden more than any fertilizer would for sure. Like I said, the bin is more for us, right? And over time, I've kind of modified my method a little bit based on, you know, my own preferences and what has seemed to work better. So it really doesn't matter. Where I'm at now, though, is I do like kind of a larger bin and a deep bin in my beds. So you want to think about it not having a bottom or having a pretty open bottom, if possible, and having it be large and deep. Any of these can work. This was the very kind of first method that I would do with the buckets with the bottom taken out and the holes. And that was fine, but it is plastic, which you want to try and avoid if you can. Right now, I have really, this method on the end is what I have kind of landed on, these wire plant protectors. They're nice and wide, nice and deep. You can bury them really deep. And they basically, that is just holding the soil away. So the goal is to have some kind of a bin to keep the soil out of that area so that then you can create that habitat. And the benefit with doing something in your bed as opposed to outside the bed, it's so hot here during the summer that worms don't survive. Like if you want to have just a tub with worms, that's great, but the outdoor conditions can't be too hot or too cold. So if you want to take that inside, that's fine. But for us to do it outside, we are able to do it in our beds by using these bins. So you're going to dig a hole a little bit larger than the size of the bin, and then you'll put the bin inside. So this one, I kind of had to bend a little bit because it's a little bit smaller there, but you can see it goes nice and deep. You have access to the bottom so that the worms are free to burrow in and out if the temperature gets too hot. And you're going to put the bin in the hole and then fill in any gaps around it. Lots of different options for bins, and there's really not a wrong answer. It's really trying to figure out, you know, if you have something on hand, if you have hardware cloth, form it into the wire. Use what you have, because the bin doesn't necessarily, it doesn't matter what it is necessarily.
How deep is deep?
How deep is deep? At least 12 inches. At least 12 inches deep. Okay, so we're gonna we've got it in the bed. So now you're gonna fill the bottom half with shredded cardboard or wood chips. And basically we're providing a habitat for those worms. And the worms really do love that shredded cardboard. I get a lot of questions about where to get shredded cardboard. I just shred my own, and that's the shredder that I used right there. It just zips through all that cardboard. So there's a good use for all of those Amazon boxes that are coming or going to be coming in the next little bit. And paper doesn't work, it gets a little bit too sticky. But shredded cardboard, something about that, they just really, and I've noticed that now as I reset a lot of my vermicomposting bins this fall, and I've been going back in and feeding them, and they really do like that cardboard. And so then what we're gonna do is we're gonna wet it down and then just kind of allow it to sit for a little bit before we're adding worms. And this is just the first time that you're adding them. So we're gonna add 300 to 600 red wiggler worms. So does it have to be red wigglers? I mean, could you go around and find worms? Possibly, but red wigglers are ideal for vermicomposting. That's what they love to do. They love to be in the top layers of the soil, and they can eat a lot of food. And that's exactly what we want them to do. So earthworms aren't as ideal, and red wigglers also tolerate Arizona's heat. So that's a really good choice. I get mine at Arizona Worm Farm. So it's best if you can find a local source for those rather than having them shipped to you if possible. Yeah, and the Worm Farm, honestly, if you're really interested in vermicomposting, they offer classes where you're actually doing it hands-on, and it'll be more than just a section of a class. So I would highly recommend, if you're really interested or want to learn more, or as you're doing it, if you're having problems too, that taking one of those classes is a lot of fun. Okay, so we've got our worms in, but we're gonna give them food scraps. So you're adding about 1 inch of food scraps, and then you're covering that up with browns. And so browns are basically anything that was a tree. You know, leaves, wood chips, you know, anything like that, but you're putting a nice thick layer of browns on. If we don't cover that, what's gonna happen here? Yeah, you're gonna get bugs, you're gonna get all kinds of stuff. So giving a nice thick layer of browns, and then adding a lid. I used to always add lids. I've actually moved away from adding lids because, so you can, it just depends on what your needs are. The cockroaches like it really dark, and so I found when I had a lid, I would get more cockroaches. But without a lid, that's less of a problem. And someone was telling me today, if you have issues with birds getting into your bins and you don't necessarily want to have a lid, they put hardware cloth along the top. So that's a great idea if you have birds kind of digging in your bins. They found out where the worms are, right? Yeah. All right, so about once a week, you're going to take off all of the browns off of the top of that, because you'll see that layer. It's interesting, you fill it up, and it's amazing. I mean, it really does work. You fill that, you know, put some food scraps in, cover it with browns, and then you'll see that layer go down. About once a week, remove the browns, remove those wood chips off the top, and then you're gonna add 1 inch of food, and then cover with browns again. And you can do this process over and over. You don't have to harvest the castings each time. I generally don't. I will usually, over a season, let this just kind of build up, and it's gonna get more and more full with worm castings over time. The castings will kind of be in the bottom. The worms will stay at the food level. What can you feed worms? They will eat a lot of things, and these are their favorites. These are the things that if you put in there, sweet potatoes in particular, when you are making your sweet potatoes for Thanksgiving, save those skins, put them in there. I feel like anything like that they love so much. So all of these things are good things. There are a lot of other things you can feed worms, and over time, as you feed your worms and then you go back in to add more food, you might see things that are still left over that maybe they didn't eat. Go ahead and just take those out and realize, okay, maybe the worms don't like that, or that piece was too big. But generally, worms will eat a lot of different things, but these are their favorites. So if you have this, or what I love in the spring, sometimes the birds will get my peaches, right? Get to them, And there's not a lot of peach left, but it's perfect to put in your worm bins because those peaches, they'll just get eaten up. So it's a really good place to put any kind of leftovers or anything like that from all of these things. So when the food scraps are gone, the worms will leave. And eventually you'll see that there are worm castings in there. You pull those wood chips back, and it really is, it's amazing. You pull the wood chips back, and what's left are these worm castings. And you can tell, I think, in this picture pretty well. The texture is different. It's not soil, it's not compost, it's really grainy. It's a different thing, and those are worm castings. And those are the freshest worm castings you will ever get because they were made right in your garden. They have the most microbial activity, and they are ready to add all around your garden. So when you're ready to do that, you would just, scoop it out and put them in a bucket, take them around your garden, put them in your garden, put them in that same bed, add them to your containers, and then just spray those in, and they will work into the beds. And then if you want to start that whole process over again, you just keep doing it. If you've kind of emptied everything out, it's good to start again with fresh cardboard, but you don't have to add worms. The worms are already in your beds. When you make the conditions right for them, they will come back into the bin, and keep that process going. So what happens in the summer, right? It gets really hot. Those worms, because they have access to the bottom, are going to burrow down. Some may die, but they're going to leave cocoons and eggs behind. And next, like right now, as temperatures are right, you're going to see the worms come back into your bins. So it's always a good idea at the beginning of the fall season to kind of refresh those bins and get it going again, and you'll see the worms, come back into your bins. So here are the resources for in-bed worm composting. This is a blog post. This is all about what to feed, what not to feed. And then this last article, I get a lot of questions, and I work with Zach at Arizona Worm Farm to answer them because this is what he does all day, every day. So if I get a question, I'll usually run it by Zach and say, hey, what do you think about this? And so that FAQ has developed from years of me asking Zach questions that I get from people and all of his answers. So that's what that blog post is. There's a whole list of questions, and then it links to the answers. So if you have a question, chances are it's answered in that FAQ blog post. It's a really good resource. And if there's a question that's not asked, leave a comment on that blog post. And if I know it, I'll answer it, but I'll probably still run it by Zach just to make sure that you're getting the most correct information. Because the more that we've done this through the years, I've been doing this since 2020, we've learned about different things as well, like changing the bins up a little bit and things like that. That's a good question. So as often as your bed is watered. So that's the beauty of having them in your garden is as you water your garden, you're also going to be watering the worms. So it happens naturally. It really takes a lot of the friction out of having worms because what's happening in the bed is, it benefits the worms. And even if you never take the worm castings out of the bed, they are still benefiting your bed because all of that microbial activity is remaining in your bed, and it will still benefit your bed if you don't ever want to harvest the castings. All right, traditional composting. I started out composting. I got these bins from the city of Mesa. A lot of the cities offer them. It's a cut-off garbage can with holes drilled in them. And I started doing it, and I grew bugs. Lots and lots of bugs. And so I was like, City of Mesa, come pick these up. I don't know what I'm doing. This is horrible. So it is a little bit trickier, I will say that. But then when I took my Master Gardener classes, I worked alongside Pam Perry, who is a legend in Arizona gardening. And she put us to work every week, like composting. And after doing it, I realized what I had done wrong. And so hopefully I can share some of that with you today so that you won't be so exasperated when you do it, but just know that it is a process that kind of has a little bit of a learning curve, but it's worth it because when I started composting and adding that to my garden, That made the hugest difference in my garden. All of a sudden, I could see my plants just be happier and growing well. So this is definitely something I would recommend, and it is a skill worth developing. If you're just getting started gardening and you're already overwhelmed with all of the information that there is about gardening, don't feel like you have to start composting. In-bed vermicomposting is an excellent kind of easy method, but once you're ready and you have the inputs, it's definitely worth it to learn more about composting because, again, the freshest compost is going to be the ones that you make yourself. So that's always going to be better than something in a bag or anything else is something that you make yourself. So we're layering, basically the method is we're layering browns and greens are layered, and we're adding in air and water. And sometimes we're transferring that from one bin to another as it breaks down. So that's just a brief overview of that method there. So before we get started, we want to choose the location. The hardest part about composting here in the low desert is often that the compost dries out so quickly. Our air is so dry, we don't get a lot of rain. And so we're looking for an area that is shady because you're actually going to be working. You're in there with a pitchfork and things like that, so you want a little bit more shade if possible. And it needs to be wide enough that you can have your bins, but also get a wheelbarrow back there because you're going to be taking inputs in and out of that area, and you need access to water with a hose. And so those are the kind of the things when you think about where do I want to compost. So this can be kind of in an area of your yard that you really don't want to look at. I don't ever tell people, put your garden someplace you'll never see it, because you won't ever see it. But compost, put it someplace you'll never see it, that's shady, back somewhere, and it'll do a lot of, it'll earn its real estate space for sure. So the bin actually, to heat up enough to get that, action going, it needs to be the right size. So at least 3 feet wide and 2 to 3 feet deep. That gives it enough mass that the compost can heat up. Otherwise, if it's too small, it doesn't have enough action inside to heat it up. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. And it's nice to have 2 bins because as you're doing this, it's nice when you're adding air in or you're moving your compost, it's nice to be able to move it from one to another. And so you're keeping that going, but you're going to have compost at different stages, right? And you eventually want to have some compost that's completely broken down, but when you have more inputs ready to put in, you want some place to put them. So it's nice to have a couple of different areas because you will have compost at different stages. And if you can have a lid to keep it from drying out as quickly. So one of the first things, if it rains, one of the first things I will do is run out and open up my compost bins. I think hopefully my neighbors can't see me do that, but I'm already the crazy plant lady. But you run out, open up those bins because we want any moisture we can get into our bins. That's, again, one of the hardest parts about composting here. So lots of different options. Really, again, use what you have access to. Even if you just want to start in a pile, don't let not having the right or a beautiful system keep you from composting because it doesn't matter too much. Contact local city, see if they offer. Like I say, the Mesa offers those for $5, and I think other cities do too. And they go in and out of having them available. Composting gets more popular, less popular. So just check back if they don't have them right now. What to compost? So this is where we're talking about, coffee or tea grounds. Starbucks, not all of them, but a lot of them, if you ask them for the coffee grounds, they will give them to you. And those are things you wouldn't want to put them directly into your garden bed, but once you compost them, they're awesome. Chicken manure, if you have chickens, we don't want to put the chicken manure directly into our beds. It's too hot. It's not good for your beds. But adding that to our compost, perfect. Veggie scraps, yard trimmings, leaves, grass clippings. Why not Bermuda? Does anybody want to answer that for me? Okay.
Because it is evil. Over everything. I'm trying to get rid of it.
Yeah, so Bermuda is who asked the question? Right here. Okay, so Bermuda grass, it spreads by stolons, and if there's just a little piece of it, it will spread and add. And once it gets established, it's easy to grow here. It's on the list of crops that are easy to grow. So you really want to avoid adding that. If you're getting your compost up to 140, 150 consistently, you're going to kill that and break it down. But as a general home gardener, the best advice is just to avoid adding Bermuda, because you don't want to spread Bermuda around your garden bed. Yeah.
I have a question about the yard trimmings.
Okay, so she's asking about trimming vines from like tangerine crossvine or things like oleander. I don't put those in my compost. Again, if you get your compost hot enough, those are all going to break down and it will be fine. But it's better, I would say, if you can avoid putting those things in there in the first place, and then that way it's not an issue. You're looking for a combination of greens and browns. And so things like coffee and tea grounds, chicken manure, veggie scraps, green grass clippings, green yard trimmings, those are all green inputs. So it doesn't matter anything from that. We're going to have a varied, inputs. But is it green or brown? And brown would be things that are dried and kind of dried up. So the mixture of those two things together is what's going to heat it up. Just the greens or just the browns, but it doesn't matter necessarily which ones. Using your food scraps in your vermicomposting bins is perfect, because we can have those a little bit every day, and that's why traditional composting with food scraps is difficult, because adding just a little bit every day isn't really the way that you're doing this traditional composting. It is more of a large scale, I've got my greens and my browns and I'm layering them. It's more of a bigger process, which is, I feel like the vermicomposting has really simplified food scrap gardening. It's made it so simple to take advantage of those. So it's totally fine that you don't have those. Okay. So citrus will eventually break down over time, but it will take a little bit longer. And so you may not want to put citrus in there. So we'll get to some of these questions here too. Okay, so what not to compost? Citrus could be put on this list, but if it will eventually break down. It will just take longer. I have, when we're in citrus season and we're juicing, you've got all of these rinds that you've got. I've actually filled up a compost bin with those, and it does break down eventually. It just takes a while. So it's fine. So these are things that we don't, as a home gardener, want to add to our compost. Anything with meat, bones, dairy, pet waste, weeds, anything that has diseased, oil. This can be more difficult to break down. It can attract rodents, and it can also have pathogens. So we don't want to add any of those things to our compost, especially as a home gardener. Larger scale operations may be able to heat it up so much that those things don't matter. But for us, we want to keep the rats out of our compost, so not have any of these things. Make sure we're not adding more diseases to our garden. So when you're at the end of the season or during the season, if you have a plant that's diseased, like powdery mildew or something like that, just put it in your trash. Don't put it into your compost. So we're going to build the compost pile. We're going to layer greens and browns. And again, this is a pretty obvious example of greens. This would, like winter grass is one of the best things. I don't do winter grass anymore, but when I took this picture, I did. It's actually one of the best inputs for compost, because it's, you've got a lot of it, a little bit every week, and all the leaves are falling down at that time of year, so it actually is pretty good for composting. So you're going to do a layer of greens and browns, and then add water as you go. You want to make sure that there's moisture in there. If the greens are really wet, you may not need to add moisture. But you're basically adding a thin layer at a time. If you put in a too thick of a layer, that's going to cause issues. So it's really thinking about adding layer, and you're going to have more as a ratio of more browns than greens, because those greens are kind of superpowered, right? Those greens are going to supercharge that and begin breaking down. And we really want to get, ideally, that pile size within that bin to 3 by 3. That's kind of the magic size to help it break down. You layer everything in, and you want to top with browns, have the top pile be browns, again, for that same reason. If you leave greens on the top, you're gonna open it up and it's gonna be full of flies and full of things. So we always wanna cover, anytime you have greens, cover that with browns, and then put that lid on and just wait. And then the magic will happen. So this is a compost thermometer. I was gonna bring it with me, I forgot, but it has just the thing, the thermometer on the top and then a long stake, right? And you put that down into your pile and you get to watch that temperature heat up. So I remember the first time that I successfully did my compost and I put that thermometer in there and it went up. So I ran inside and got all my family, I have 5 kids, and I'm like, you guys have got to see this. So they all came out to the compost. They're like, oh my gosh, what are we doing? But they saw it, and I was so excited. It was just a big family moment that we all enjoyed seeing my compost heat up. But it was a big deal to me because I had struggled and not been successful, and then to have it be successful was very, very rewarding. So having a compost thermometer isn't 100% necessary, but it is nice because it lets you know what's going on in the pile. You can always dig down in there and you're gonna feel that heat coming up, so you're gonna know, okay, it's working. But sometimes, this is as exciting as it gets in gardening, right? This is like instant gratification. So it's nice to put a number on it so that you know, okay, this compost is heating up. And so while it's heating up, you just leave it alone because you've done your part and now it's doing its part by breaking down all of those actions inside. It's going to just keep going, but eventually it's going to run out of water, air, food, all of those things. And so that you're going to see that gauge come down. And that's what tells you, okay, now it's time for me to do my part again. If you want to keep the process going and be done as quickly as possible, it'll be time for you to do it. So step 3, once it cools down, we're going to add more air and water back into it. And that's when it becomes nice to have more than one bin, because the easiest way to add air and water to that whole pile is by using a pitchfork and transferring it from one, or having your kid transfer it from one into the other, and then having the other kid stand there and spray it. So Saturday jobs, this was, my kids are getting older, I just have one now at home, but this was a big Saturday job, transferring the compost from one to the other and then spraying it down as you go, because you're adding in more air and water to that pile and you're gonna feed it, you're basically feeding it again. And so then once you do that, again, close the lid and then put that thermometer in, and you're going to be able to check that and see it's within a day or two, it's going to heat right back up. And you're going to repeat that process each time as you go. So eventually, it's going to look not like the inputs that you put in, it will look like compost, right? And it will smell like compost, like it smells good, it smells earthy. It's eventually, you'll be able to tell when you're done, and you don't need to do that anymore. Because, and usually it's, I would say, depending on your inputs, so we try and cut them up or make them small if possible. It can take as little as a month, really. You're just doing, if you're staying on it, 3 to 4 weeks and you can have good compost. So watch your compost. When it goes down below 100, you're gonna mix, add air, and then you just keep doing it until you're done. And then you get to add your finished compost to top off your beds each season and when you plant. So it's always wonderful to have this bin of completed compost, because you think, oh, where am I going to put this? And all of a sudden, you know, everywhere you look, there's something that will need compost. Everything in your garden will benefit from compost, for sure. Your yard, trees, not just your garden beds. Having compost is, again, just wonderful to have. Okay, so that sounded really simple, right, as I talked about it. But things can go wrong. It can be difficult sometimes. Common issues that you can face with composting. If it's not heating up, you did everything, we went through the steps, you put it in, you call out your family, nothing, right? There's nothing happening. So a couple of things. Either the pile is too small, there's not enough mass, or there's not enough green material. If you just have the browns, then it's not going to, the greens are what is going to help that get going. And so that will make a difference. So what you'll need to do is make the pile larger, add more, or add in more greens. And again, greens would be things like, yard clippings, coffee grounds, anything green and living, that's still got some life in it. Slimy, right? Have you ever smelled the slimy compost, right? Too many thick layers of green. If you've got winter grass in there and you have that layer too thick, it's going to get slimy. If you've got too many food scraps in there, it's going to get slimy. They're not going to create things and help them break down. Instead, they're just going to kind of sit there and just rot. And that's what creates that slime. So, but that's easy to fix, right? You're going to break up the layers and add in brown. So once you add in more browns, that will fix that. Okay, if you go out and your compost stinks, it should not stink. As you do it, it'll smell earthy, especially as it heats up. Kind of has a distinctive, I really like it because it feels like, okay, this is a good thing, but earthy kind of smell. But if it's stinky, it's not right. So that usually means there's too many browns if it stinks. So go ahead and add in more, or too many greens if it's stinky. So go ahead and add in more browns. If you have a lot of insects, a lot of flies, this is what I was doing wrong when the first time that I was composting. That means usually you're leaving those greens or foods, any of the greens on the top exposed. That's going to attract, all the pests and things. So cover those with a thick layer of browns. And then that should eliminate all of that. And if you're finding that you're getting a lot of flies when you're doing it, make sure that you're covering it. You can also use you shouldn't have a lot of flies when you're doing it, but sometimes things just get off balance. They do have those hanging bags that are fly traps that can be really effective that I use by my chicken coop. But if things get off balance, hanging up one of those can help kind of bring it back into balance again. All right, so here's some resources. How to compost, that's a blog post. It walks you through kind of the 10 steps that we talked about. And then here's a YouTube video about the same process that walks you through each one of those things. And the question and answer section on the How to Compost will also have some really good questions for you. I probably have time for like 1 or 2 questions about composting if we... Okay, so tumbler type composting can be effective. I haven't done that method as much, but it's the same principles of green and browns and then using that, the tumbler to kind of mix them up and things. I have not done that as much.
Very hot.
Oh, does it? Okay.
Very hot.
Oh, in the summer. Yeah, so you're using a different kind of heat to break that down, which works. Okay, yes. Okay, so she's asking, can she put the chicken, she has chickens, can I put the shavings and the chicken poop into my vermicomposting bins and my compost bins? And yes, in small amounts, you can put it into your vermicomposting bins, and all of it can go into your compost. So yeah, nice. Okay, one more question.
As far as ratio, like the size of the...
That's a good question. So how many vermicomposting bins do you need in each bed or each in the garden? Just one. No matter the size, just one. Those, as long as there's soil in there, it will have access to those microbes. So you just need one bin per bed or per in-ground area. So if your bed, that's a good point. If your bed is 20 feet long, you might need more than one, but generally for most raised beds, one is sufficient for, I would say, 8 to 10 feet. So thank you. Okay, so water conservation. We're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about water conservation. And so why save water? I mean, I think that's a really pretty simple question. When we live in a desert, we know that water is scarce. We know that we want to do our best to make the most of this natural resource, right? And to be good stewards. Gardening can use a lot of water. We want to think about ways to reduce our water consumption and make the most of any water that falls onto our property as well. So these are some of the reasons. We could probably spend a long time listing more reasons, but we want to make sure that we're being sustainable, right? We're preserving the natural ecosystems. You know, when you get your water bill each month, you want to keep it lower, right? We want to save some money by conserving water. And we also want to be more resilient during times of drought, right? We don't want to have a yard full of high water use plants that require a lot of water. And when drought comes, they're going to struggle, right? That's going to be the first things to go. So being mindful of the water use of what you plant in your yard and what you're using is important. So trying to understand and adopt some water-saving techniques. So one of the things that we can do, we don't get a lot of rain, but when it rains, hopefully, it pours, right? So we want to take advantage of any rain that's coming into our yard. Half an inch of rain will deliver more than half a gallon per square foot of surface. So there's a math computation you can do with your roof to figure out, how much rain. So this isn't my house. I have gutters along. This is just on my side yard. And when we get a good rainstorm, this fills up quite a bit. It's amazing how quickly it fills up from the water that comes onto my roof. So take advantage of any water that comes into your yard. Look for ways to harvest and channel rainwater. So it's not necessarily just harvesting it in the big rain barrel, like I say, but you can also create berms and channels throughout your yard to encourage the water rather than just running off down the street or down the driveway. Figuring out how I can channel that water within my yard to take advantage of free water, right? And the best water that's coming from the sky, we want to just take advantage of that. So think about your yard in a little bit different way, especially as you are, planting and planning your yard. Think about how to do that. And of course, this is something it's not, you're going to go home now today and be able to figure out all of the things. I just want to introduce you to this idea because up until a few years ago, I hadn't even really thought about how can I channel the rainwater in my yard. I always just thought, I need a rain barrel or I need something like that. But last year, I have a gutter. The gutter would be over here. It has a spout that goes under the ground and pops up right here behind this tree. And so when it rains, instead of, flowing out into my driveway, that rainwater comes in here and will deep water my citrus and pomegranate trees here. So I'd never even thought about that before. So today I really would just like to introduce you to the idea of doing that. You may already be doing this. You may know a lot about it, but I didn't a couple years ago. And so think about that, especially as you're setting up your landscaping in your yard, that there are ways to channel rainwater. It doesn't just have to be big storage tanks all over your yard. It could just be as simple as, where do I put my gutter, putting on gutters, and where do I channel that rainwater? Creating microclimates, right? Planting things together. Putting low water use or high water use plants together can help reduce water consumption. That way you're not overwatering or underwatering different things. And then if you have more plants, they're also going to reduce the evaporation that comes off. It's going to keep that water in the soil longer. We talked about with somebody over the summer, I think, was it you? We're talking about leaving our beds bare over the summer and what happens to our soil, right? It's just going to dry out and become difficult to work with. So it's kind of the idea with our gardens or our yards too, just having living plants and things to help keep that microclimate, keep that moisture, and minimize the water, grouping plants with similar requirements together. So the water that we are using, we're using it more efficiently. Good watering practices, right? We're not going out with sprinklers, that so much of the water evaporates before it gets to the yard. Watering in the morning if possible so that there's less evaporation. Adding mulch And mulch, it could be, you know, mulch in our garden beds, but it also could just be even rock mulch or anything that can kind of hold that moisture in the soil. Drip irrigation is an effective way to water, and it maximizes your water use. And then learning good watering practices. All plants, whether it's in your landscape or your grass or your garden beds, will benefit from watering correctly, right? If we just water a little bit every day, we're encouraging those roots to be really kind of shallow, right? But if we're watering deeply, less often, we're encouraging those plant roots to grow nice and deep, and so that they have access to more water, and they're not going to dry out as quickly. That soil at the top is going to dry out much more quickly than the soil down below. So if we're having good watering practices, we're helping our plants use less water. And then during the summer, making conscious choices about how much water we're using during the summer, because it takes more water to grow a garden over the summer, to do a lot of things over the summer. So, you know, putting away small containers, not gardening in small containers over the summer, making choices about, you know, what we choose to water. You can keep your soil alive by using mulch and cover crops, and they use minimal water. You know, just a little bit of water to keep things going, but not high water use. And then always checking your soil before you water, because as gardeners, we really do tend to overwater more than underwater. We feel like we want to do something, because right now, water needs of our plants have gone way down, right? We need to be watering much, much less. And it kind of shifted really fast. It went from, okay, your plant needs water, but once those nighttime temperatures cool down and the days are shorter, that soil is not going to dry out as quickly, even when it's really hot. Even though we had that kind of heat snap, you know, the soil stayed hydrated longer. So I probably say this a lot, but check your soil. Don't just assume that it's time to water. Get to know your irrigation schedule, your irrigation. You know, mine's an app on my phone, or if yours is on the wall of your house. Understand how it works so you can change it as the seasons change. Don't just use the same watering frequency for your grass and landscape and shrubs all year long, because they certainly don't need it. Turn it off, you know, in December and January. You probably don't need to water much. Eliminate unused grass. You know, again, I have 5 kids. So we definitely are an active family. We used our grass. We, you know, did a lot with it. And that's fine. I think, you know, if you're using the grass, but if you're not using the grass, there's no need to use all of those resources for the grass. So eliminate where you can any unused grass. Take a look at your yard and think, okay, if we need grass, but do we need this much? So this is a new resource. It replaces the old booklet that they had. Excellent resource. And all of the plants in here, this is put out by AMWA, AMWA. All of the plants in here are resistant, they're low water use, good desert adapted plants that are good choices. So if you had, did anybody in here have a landscape plant die over the summer? I did, for sure. So if you had something die and you want to replace it, now is a really good time. Pick something out of here and you know that it will grow well, need less water, and be less likely to die during a heat wave because it's more adapted to our growing conditions. So that is a really good resource. And just be mindful of what you're planting and what you're using in your yard. Okay, so here's kind of an overview of the tips that we talked about. You know, harvesting rainwater, creating microclimates, watering in the morning, eliminating unused grass, channeling rainwater, using drip irrigation, mulching, encouraging strong roots by watering deeply, conserving during the summer, and choosing drought-tolerant plants. And when we think about water conservation, it can feel overwhelming or like, oh, I don't know if it'll make a difference. But even just small changes in what you do over time will make a huge difference. So look at this list and think of 1 or 2 things, ways that you can implement that in your own yard and garden and household. And those little changes over time can really add up. And then as you're sometimes it's also good to think about some big changes too. You know, if you think about some other ways that you can make a bigger impact, and don't be afraid to kind of look into those and figure out the best ways to do that. But I would encourage you to be really mindful about the water usage and do the best you can. And I think if everybody tries a little bit harder to be a little better, that it'll make a difference. It will make a difference. So thank you so much. I think we are out of time. Resources, as always, on growinginthegarden.com for the things we talked about. My planting guides are right here. Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to have people that are excited about composting. Best of luck to you. Enjoy the fall season. Thank you.